Welcome to Global Connections, Navigating the New Abnormal, a virtual leader forum by Zoom, sponsored by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, representing Israel's premier hospital, the Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. American Friends of Rabin Medical Center welcomes you. We're a national 501(c) nonprofit, and this is our monthly forum, and today is the first time, and we thank all our panelists. We are extremely delighted to have as our moderator on a monthly basis the esteemed Robert Siegel, the longtime co-host of All Things Considered from National Public Radio, a position he served in for 30 years, and we're glad to welcome him, and I hand it over to you. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Josh. I'm Robert Siegel, and for over 30 years, as Josh said, I hosted NPR's news magazine, All Things Considered. And like so many Americans for the past few months, I've spent a lot of time stunned by the changes that we've experienced, the changes in daily routines, in our dealings with family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, local merchants, changes in economic confidence, and changes in social and political attitudes, even towards such basic, if difficult, questions as racial difference and the criminal justice system. In the series of web seminars that the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center is launching today, we're seeking to understand these changes. We're going to ask people from different walks of life how they're experiencing this remarkable time and what they foresee. Obviously, there are aspects of the coronavirus pandemic, of the economic consequences of the pandemic, and of the wave of protests that Americans have taken part in, that when we think back on them in a couple of years, they may seem strangely antique. But there are also aspects of these three powerful sets of changes that may reshape our country, our economy, and our society. So today we're going to hear from four panelists who are going to try to make sense of this season of profound change. After I interview them, I'll put to them the questions that you submit by using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. I'll tell you more about that later. You should identify which person you're directing your question to. We're going to hear from Scott Rechler about real estate, from Yuval Rooz about technology, from Dr. Michael Drescher of the Rabin Center about medicine, public health, of course, COVID-19. And we're going to start with a bird's eye view of how these events may change American politics and society from Dionne, columnist for the Washington Post and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. joins us from Washington, D.C. And welcome to our first panel on navigating the new abnormal. It's good to have you. I want to begin, by the way, by telling people a little bit about EJ and David Brooks, who will be joining us at the next panel. I'll give you details on that at the end of the hour. Used to be Friday regulars on All Things Considered every week, talking about politics. I always enjoyed moderating their segment because they're the two people I know for whom politics is both a scholarly discipline and also a reporter's beat. They know it in all kinds of ways. has written many books in addition to his column about politics and society. The most recent one is Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. Can we see you?
Can you see me there? I
can.
I want to say, Robert, before you begin, two things. One, it's an honor to be here for the Rabin Center, but it's a real joy to be with Robert. If Robert asked me to do a session on basket weaving or cricket, about which I know nothing, I would study up and do it because I love and admire you, Robert, so much. So it's great to be here.
Well, you've just described the September show that we're going to be doing. So I want to ask you about what of the changes we've experienced, what's something that strikes you as perhaps really enduring and changing our country, and what's something that strikes you as perhaps more of the moment and passing?
Yeah, I'm going to do plan A and plan B. I think plan A is what will happen, and plan B is the unlikely thing. I'll start with plan B. A lot hangs on whether Donald Trump is reelected. If Donald Trump is reelected, which I do not believe he will be, and we can talk about that, then he ends up being the memorable figure of this era of everything, because despite everything that happened, despite the catastrophe in the economy and the health problems, he still somehow would have managed to assemble at least a majority in our antique electoral college. But I don't think that is what is going to happen. And therefore, I think in the long run, we may in fact remember Trump the least out of this period. I'm developing a theory that what the country thought happened when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, the first time, that we were entering a new period, that a new generation of Americans was going to be dominant not only in government, but also in the electorate, that a new spirit would take hold in the country that was accepting, even welcoming of many of the cultural changes and certainly the demographic changes, that would be dominant. Trump interrupted that. And the question is, was that the end of that or simply an interlude? I think it will prove to be an interlude. And if Trump loses, and especially if he loses in a landslide, the people who will be most eager to forget Donald Trump will be Republicans. We will learn very quickly of how many doubts they had about Donald Trump going along, that for one reason or another, they weren't willing to talk about. Therefore, the enduring changes from this period, I think, are interrelated. One is the way in which the pandemic combined with the protests on behalf of racial justice have reminded us of the very, very deep inequalities in the country. We've been talking about inequality really since the economic downturn of 2008, 2009. But the pandemic has brought those inequalities into sharp relief. The chairman of the Federal Reserve made a point of noting that among Americans earning under $40,000 a year, 40% were unemployed, whereas well-off Americans have been able to continue to work. On the whole, probably roughly 3/4 of very high-income Americans have been able to continue to work, have not seen their incomes interrupted, and the virus itself has struck very hard at African Americans and at low-income people generally. And so I think we will remember that part of this that could lead to political change. And lastly, very quickly, we will also learn the need for competent government. And I'll just leave it at that, because I think we could see from this pandemic a whole series of problems with the way our government worked. You can't run down government forever rhetorically without beginning to see some deterioration in the way it performs.
There were some big ifs there in your scenarios, and let me ask you, EJ, do you think that the Democrats are likely to be running in the fall on the matter of profound inequities in American life, whether it's dealing with criminal justice system or what kind of work people do or what kind of health people are in? Or is that going to be deemed too radical a message for the Democratic Party as it tries to reach out to more suburban and even rural voters?
Well, I think the core theme of the Biden campaign was the theme he set out right at the beginning on the day he announced his candidacy, which is 4 years of Trump will be an aberration, 8 years of Trump will change the country fundamentally and not in good ways. And that is clearly the message that appeals to the suburban voters you're talking about. But I think what we're seeing in the response to the George Floyd killing, but also in the response to the inequalities in the pandemic itself, is that this concern about inequities extends beyond just very poor people in the country or beyond the African American or Latino communities. There's a sense of unfairness, injustice that permeates right into the middle class. I think the most striking and the most resonant part of that are the inequities of our health system. The number of people, including a lot of middle class people, who, when they lost their jobs, also lost their health care. Losing health care in the middle of a pandemic is a very dangerous thing for an individual or a family. And so I think there are ways of talking about inequity that reach beyond a slice of the electorate to, at this point, I think, a majority of the electorate. And it's worth noting that Biden's program is much more progressive than the program that Barack Obama ran on in 2008 or than Hillary Clinton ran on in 2016. He was already there. And in conversations with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, he's made it a bit more progressive, but he's tended to pick popular progressive ideas. Lowering the age of eligibility for Medicare is very popular with the 23 million Americans between the ages of 60 and 65. So that is a push, in theory, to the left that is actually a very mainstream sort of push.
EJ, I want you to address one other point about politics, and that is what's happened to our elections recently. This is related to the pandemic, and that in a move toward more mail-in voting, this has been controversial. We've seen some highly publicized problematic elections in Wisconsin and most recently Georgia. You wrote a column about the primaries in the District of Columbia, a Democratic pocket borough, as one would have said, and in the state of Maryland, a Democratic state with a popular Republican governor, which held primaries, which were they weren't covered very, very heavily. They were catastrophic. We're finding states that can't pull off an election under these circumstances.
I am very, very, very worried about our election in November. I think it could be a catastrophe. And in state after state during the pandemic, including one of the reasons I wrote about DC and Maryland is these were states that were trying to do the right thing. There was no objection to sending mail ballots out, trying to send mail ballots out to everyone. The Republican governor and the Democrats broadly agreed on how to conduct the election. And yet we still had enormous problems. And of course, we've seen such problems in a big way in Georgia more recently. In Kentucky today, where there's a primary, there's one polling place for the whole Louisville area. So here, the things I am worried about are the following. One, with resistance to mail voting, we are going to be, we're not going to get prepared for it. There are states like Colorado that have always done mail voting for a long time. They will have no problems. In this election, even if we don't change any law, many, many more people are going to vote by mail because they are afraid of the virus and don't want to go to a polling place. Many states are ill-equipped to handle to send out and handle the number of ballots they're going to have to handle. But number two, and this really alarms me, we are having a lot of trouble opening polling places for people who don't get their mail ballots in states where they have to apply, whose applications get lost, or if they do them wrong, they have to show up and vote either early or on election day. And in state after state, we don't have enough polling places. There are all kinds of reasons for that. One of them is, as you know, Robert, we have often relied on retirees to be the folks at the polling places. My late mother-in-law was a faithful person at her polling place in New York every year. Retirees cannot cover the polling places during a pandemic. So we need to recruit tens of thousands of new poll workers, and we're not doing it right now. So I am extremely worried. Last quick point, if we have a lot of mail ballots, we might not know the result of the election on election night because these ballots take a long time to count. In my county in Maryland, they only very recently, weeks after the primary, had a final result for some local races. That's going to be a very dangerous period for our country if the election is close and we're still counting mail ballots well after election day.
EJ, thanks as always, and hang around for the Q&A portion of the program. Again, people will be able to put questions to you, EJ, by using the Q&A button at the bottom. That's columnist EJ Dionne of the Washington Post, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we're now going to zoom in on one sector of the economy that's been affected by the changes of this extraordinary and difficult season, real estate. And our guest, Scott Rechler, is uniquely qualified to talk about that, especially New York area real estate. Scott Rechler, who joins us from New York, is CEO and chair of RXR, which is one of the biggest owners, managers, developers of real estate and infrastructure in the New York metropolitan region, with assets worth over $20 billion, more than 25 million square feet of commercial space, And I believe, if I read it properly, about 6,000 apartments also under management. Governor Cuomo appointed Scott Rechler to be vice chair of the Port Authority and also to the board of the New York MTA. And I'd be remiss not to note that Scott is honorary chair of the American Friends of the Rabin Medical Center. Scott Rechler, welcome. As I said, you were on the board of the MTA. So this morning, back to work. This was a rush hour you found worth tweeting about. What was your experience?
So I took the subway up from 14th Street, and it was unbelievably clean. There was a tremendous amount of signage and communication as to when the next trains are coming. People on the train were all wearing their mask, keeping their distance. I would say it was fairly sparse. There was probably at most 10 people on this train as we went up in the same car as me. But it was great. And I think that the more that people are out there using public transit and get comfortable, the more people that have anxiety that are sitting at home will get comfortable coming back to work and start using mass transit.
So let me put the New York real estate horror story to you, and you tell me how real it is or how exaggerated it is. And it's this: for the past few months, businesses have started having their employees work from home. They've discovered that you can actually get a tremendous amount done that way. So they're in no hurry to come back to office buildings. As for New York City apartments, people are fleeing for the suburbs, if not the exurbs, where they can walk around outside without a mask and where they'll have more room to work from rather than going to home. All told, a disaster for people in your line of work. How bad is it?
I think you need to divide this up into different periods, right? I mean, we came from this pandemic where everyone was working from home. That was in New York and a lot of places around the country. And now we're in what I call the new abnormal, which is where we got to coexist with the coronavirus, which again is going to take a concerted effort of how people come back to work. And it's not going to feel normal, nor should it feel normal, because we need to come back in a way that people are safe and that we're responsible. But we also got to come back in a way that we can change behavior and people can get the most out of the workforce. And I think they will adapt. I mean, I know myself being back in the office now for the last couple of days in the city and last week in our Long Island office, the interactions that I have with my team has been very different than Zoom meetings. Particularly you end the meeting, you debrief, you see someone in the hallway, you have an idea, you can check in on people personally. And the way I think about the office space nowadays is people work, instead of 9 to 5, they work from 5 to 9. And the office space has become part of their community, right? They have their colleagues here, their friends, their support groups, their mentors. This is the village that people now have adopted. So I think they're losing some of that at home, and they've been depleting social capital for working together for many, many years. But each day that social capital goes away. For New York in particular, people have read and written New York's obituary many, many times. I've lived through a number of crises in New York, from 9/11 to Superstorm Sandy, the Great Recession. And each time New York proves its resilience, reinvents itself, and comes back stronger. And I have no doubt that's going to happen this time as well. The question is how long and what it's going to look like on the other side. And to EJ's point, I think good, effective government is going to be a big factor in the success and the vibrancy and vitality that New York comes back with.
But let's say that I'm a big corporate client of yours. First of all, am I typically back in full force? Am I typically back in less than full force? And what do you tell me about the workplace, how it might be changed to instill confidence in my staff that it's worth going into work?
Yeah, so we have 25 million square feet, and some of the largest Fortune 500 companies are our tenants. And their number one priority is for the safety of their team members. And so that's been clear, and we've done everything we can using technology and physical protocols and changing behaviors to do that. The second thing is giving people the comfort that they are safe. So being safe and feeling safe, because it's a psychological element, right? People have been scared to stay home on purpose, so we can bend the curve, help our healthcare systems with its capacity. But now it's time to come back to work, but they're psychologically anxious about that, which is understandable. The third is to give them transparency, give them the tools to understand what's happening in the workplace, where there's congestion, let them have visibility of what coming back to work is going to be like, what's the health and wellness of the building, what's the air quality that's happening within the building. Empower them with information so that if they're going to come back to work, they feel confident that they're doing it in a way that is smart. And then
But if my workplace, if my offices are on the 50th floor, how do my staff use the elevator? How long does it take to move the workforce up to the office?
So we developed a program we call RxWell, and it starts at home. Everyone has an app. Every one of our people that come back are signing on to the RxWell app. When they get up in the morning, the first thing they'll do is they'll see what rotation they're in, because people are only coming in at about 50%. So the blue team, white team, red team, black team. Then we're asking people to come in at a staggered opening. So 7:30 to 8, 8 to 8:30, they'll see what staggered opening they are, and then they'll get depending on that, what the best transit back to the offices. Then they'll fill out a wellness questionnaire that will take their temperature. They answer 5 questions. If they get a green card, they come to work. If they get a red card, they stay at home. If they want to challenge that red card, they can hit a button to get a virtual care clinician who will then ask them a series of other questions who can override that red card. When they come to the office, they'll walk in through an area and they'll have their temperature taken through a thermal scanner. So just as they walk in, we'll have wellness concierges that will be able to see everyone's temperature as they come in. If someone has a temperature above 100.4, they'll be asked to step into this wellness area that we have. They'll use a scientific handless thermometer to check again the temperature. If it's still over 104, we'd ask them to go home or to get a medical attention. And then to your point, coming in the elevators, we have Bluetooth, so you won't touch the elevator. It will signal you when you use your card which elevator to go to. It will limit the number of people in the elevator. So depending on the size of the elevators, it can be 4 people up to 8 people. You'll get into that elevator. You'll stand in a square or circle and look forward with your mask on. Everyone's wearing a mask full time. And then you go up to your space. And so, the concept is make everyone, safe, wear masks, be responsible. And then in your space, try to find a way to create, make the new abnormal as normal as possible.
But I'm trying to imagine that this is a new way of going to work that you're describing. Do you think of it as a provisional emergency that may be the case for a couple of years? Or do you think of it as the way that people are going to think of work for the next couple of decades?
So when I lived through 9/11, we had a similar parallel, which was safety, right? And we changed all our buildings to deal with public safety. And people were afraid to go in the towers of the buildings and high up, just like they were afraid to fly planes. And for the very beginning, we put some extreme measures in, right? Where people put their car in, we would check underneath to see if there was bombs. We checked their trunk. We checked every purse and every bag that was coming into our buildings. Put turnstiles in. For those who don't remember, there used to not be turnstiles. You could just walk into a building, go upstairs, security measures, a lot of different things that we put in. And for 18 months, we were extreme. But while that 18 months was happening, there was a lot of infrastructure that was being built around it. Homeland Security, Joint Terrorist Task Force, new tools. And so people began to get more comfortable. But some of that stays on. And I think the same thing is going to be on with wellness, is that some of the more extreme things will shed away. And some of the things that are good anyway will stay on.
In a way, one possibility is that the virus becomes endemic in a way that major massive terror attacks did not become endemic. They were sporadic events that happened in different places. Ultimately, do you go to bed praying for a vaccine? Is what I really want to know. In order for this to be said right, do we have to have a major medical breakthrough?
Yeah, I think I'm one of those who, obviously I would love a vaccine, but I'm also one that realized that you can't, that may not be possible, right? So 2 things within that regard. One is we all need to change how we operate to coexist with the virus, because it may be here longer. The second piece is, while we're doing that, science is going to catch up. And it may not be a vaccine, but it may be rapid diagnostic testing. It may be better therapeutics. And I think some combination of changing the way that we behave and the combination of science is going to get us there. But I want to just jump back, because, EJ made a point, and I think it ties to this. I don't think we have a choice but to come back to work. Because if you really think about it, just in our buildings, for every 1 office job, it creates 5 service jobs. So we have 60,000 people that work in our buildings. That's 300,000 jobs that need to come back out to support the economy. And then, so there's a civil responsibility and there's a social responsibility. The other piece of the equation, as people have been working from home, most of them are white collar, mostly white people working from home in their country houses or their parents' houses, and our essential servicers who are out there, making sure our buildings are running, our streets are functioning, everything's functioning in our city, are mostly brown. And so you have this inequality that is even become more pronounced in this scenario. So you have to get the economy going for the economic reasons and for social reasons.
Scott Rechler of RXR, thank you very much for that, and hang around because you'll still be getting questions from attendees in the Q&A section. Joining us now from La Jolla, California, is Yuval Rooz to talk about technology in this season of enormous changes. He is CEO and co-founder of Digital Asset Holdings. His company provides software to companies to help them with digitization. And in fact, he has helped us with digitization voluntarily. He's a technical director of this panel as well. Yuval, welcome. Good to see you.
Hey, Robert. Thank you for having me.
It's been said often that the COVID-19 pandemic hasn't so much introduced changes into our lives as accelerated the pace of changes that were already underway. Let's talk about this thing that we're using, but this Zoom phenomenon, which I knew vaguely until this year. Now it's a major part of my life. Is it fair to say that for the generation of both you and your business, that the transition to Zoom dependency was no big deal?
Yeah, actually, we've been using Zoom pretty much from the first day we started the company in 2014. And I'm very happy that given all the options, Skype, Teams, WebEx, Hangouts, now Facebook chats, it seems like we chose the tool that seems to be winning the competition from popularity. So yeah, I mean, for us, it was a must-needed tool. We're a company that has offices in 6 countries, and even outside of those 6 countries, we have developers or contributors that are distributed. So for us, it was critical from day one.
We heard Scott Rechler talking about the workplace as a village, as a place where there are colleagues and mentors. And I recently read a wonderful essay of E.B. White's from the New Yorker back in 1949, a love letter to Manhattan as the greatest human concentrate on Earth. It's been implicit to many people that there's some huge benefit about people being together, about the press of people with their different ideas and skills coming together and making work happen and making theater happen and making urban life happen. Does the virtual world, is it as fruitful as that, as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, so I want to first of all start with my personal opinion that I wholeheartedly agree with Scott. I'm a very big believer that being physically co-located adds another dimension that virtual will never be able to make up for. And there are the water cooler conversations, and there are for example, we're doing a very big project with a client in Australia and with another partner in California. And I can tell you that historically, before these big delivery sessions, we would all fly into one location and spend an entire week in one room because there's just no replacing it. There are those small conversations in the break. So I definitely agree. The reality, at least from what I see in the technology scene, is that developers, especially developers, don't mind being remote and actually look for places where they can say that their work-life balance is better. And I think you start seeing the rise in Denver or in Tennessee, in different kind of not your traditional go-to tech locations of developers saying, I have a good quality of life here and I would prefer living here. And unfortunately for us, but fortunately for those developers, we need to offer that option to be able to work for us remotely if we want to go after the best talent out there.
The new workplace that Scott Rechler just described sounds like your sector of the economy, the software people have a bonanza coming their way to try to wire us for the new abnormal. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can tell you that it's a real challenge. We have Australia, as we know, really didn't get hurt by COVID, and we have a sizable office there. None of our developers want to go back to the office because they realize, at least right now, and I agree with Scott that the immediate reaction of getting adjusted to the abnormal is going to have extreme measures that hopefully will smoothen out later on. Our developers are saying, well, we'll wait for that second wave, because for us, we can be productive writing software from home. They meet at someone's house to socialize every once in a while, so they don't necessarily go to the office, and they find different ways of replacing it. And to me, that's very unfortunate, because the culture of the office is extremely important. But for us, the hit on productivity, at least in the initial phase with the extreme measures, is something that is worrying to our employees, and therefore we're giving them the options to decide if to join early to the workforce or to join later.
The issue of inequality has arisen in many ways already in this conversation. One way in which that we haven't discussed yet is the digital divide, and in the move to a great deal of effectively homeschooling with digital connectivity, we've seen great inequalities there. That it's much tougher for public school families that don't have good connectivity or up-to-date devices for their kids to be part of school in the same way as a middle-class kid. How do we redress that problem?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point and a very important point. I think that I'm dialing in from the West Coast, and generally speaking, I live on the East Coast. I think the coast, generally speaking, don't see this inequality, and I think the inequality comes in two shapes. First of all, it's just physical infrastructure. So it's not that everywhere in North America or in the United States there is equal access to the internet. And I know it is 2020, but that is still the case. And I think that when you mentioned education, but there was also no way of there are places in the United States where there isn't a local grocery store. And when you're locked home and businesses are shut, and the only thing that is available for you is online grocery shopping or online ability to buy a toilet or essentials that are needed on a day-to-day basis, not having that access to stable internet, not only education, but actually having a normal life. That's one area of inequality that I think this country and the rest of the world, not just this country, are exposed to during this kind of a pandemic. I think the second part, and this is similar to what you talked about, the generational difference, but I also think it's an educational, is that I think that for the most part, urban cities, the access to technology and education about technology is much more pervasive, where I think that even if there was internet in certain locations, the reaction or the ability to adopt something like Zoom would have been significantly different than other places. So I think that there's two areas where we need to improve inequality. One of it is the infrastructure to just give access, and the second one is the educational part that clearly is not equal in this country.
Okay, Yuval. Well, we're going to hear more from you during the question and answer session. But Yuval Rooz of Digital Asset, thank you for that.
Thank you.
And our fourth panelist joins us from the Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Israel. Dr. Michael Drescher is director of the Emergency and Trauma Center there. He also maintains a strong connection with the Hartford Hospital in Connecticut. His department at the Rabin Center serves 200,000 patients each year. It is one of only 6 level 1 trauma centers in Israel. Mike Drescher, thanks for talking with us this morning about navigating the future with COVID-19. How are you?
It's a pleasure, Robert. And if you would give me a minute to say thank you, both to you for giving your time. And I want to start by saying thanks to Josh Plout at the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. I'm sitting here in the Rabin Medical Center, and given that we are the beneficiaries, let's hope, of this interesting, really erudite discussion. I'd like to say thank you. Thank you to the guests who you've been interviewing, to Robert, to EJ, to Scott, and Yuval. It's a really, it's an honor for me to be here amongst this group. It's maybe not the easiest thing to speak after such an interesting group of people, but I'll give it my best shot.
I think you'll do fine. Here's what I read online a couple of hours ago in Yediot Achronot, in the English edition of the Israeli paper. Israel recorded the biggest daily number of coronavirus cases in months, with contagion rate being the highest since the outbreak of the epidemic in the country, according to a report published on Tuesday. Israel seems to have done pretty well so far. Are you experiencing a second wave?
We're experiencing the continuation of the first wave. The coronavirus, the COVID virus, came to Israel from abroad, as it did for most places. We were able to play to the strengths of Israel at the time, which was to shut down the one international airport and our borders, which are not very much used in any case. And so we were able to keep that external importation of the virus to a minimum, and then within the country very quickly to shut down the entire country. This led to really a quite remarkable control which benefited us in the medical system of the spread of the virus, and our mortality is very low internationally, and indeed our infection rate is very low internationally. However, as had to happen, the economy began to have to be opened, and the reins were loosened, and children were sent back to school. And with that, we've seen a very expected increase in the infection rate.
Are you concerned that it could?
Of course we're concerned. Of course we're concerned, and we are having to prepare ourselves in the hospital, in the emergency department. We have established a special area of the emergency department to take care of people who are at higher risk, either clinically or epidemiologically, for the disease. And we came to a rate where we really weren't seeing very many, if any, positive patients for COVID, but we didn't close down our special area. And now we're seeing that we're in much more need of it. And the staff is, of course, have to be re-engaged, and we have to pay special attention to our discipline in terms of taking care of our illness. But yes, we're concerned about it both at a local medical level and at a societal level.
Yeah, Israel's population is around 9 million, and that's a couple of million more than New York City. Far fewer deaths than the city experienced. It's a little bit less than Sweden, and it's far less than Sweden with a radically different approach to this, Tuck. So you seem to have had, as these things go, a relatively mild case of it nationally. I wonder, in the course of preparing for COVID-19 and then coping with it, did the medical center or the Israeli medicine in general, did it come by any collateral knowledge? That is, did you learn things that might be applicable either more broadly or in other situations because you were scrambling for solutions to the problem that you faced?
Yes, the answer is yes, although qualified, because the question of a pandemic is not new. The idea of a pandemic didn't catch us by surprise. The dealing with an actual pandemic, of course, led us to really come face to face with the real challenges. But people had been planning for and thinking about what is going to happen if we have a pandemic for many years. There was the bird flu back in 2009, I believe. So we had some experience with planning for it. We had no experience with dealing with it, and so some of the things that we've lessons learned. For instance, just yesterday, I went on a tour in our underground garage right below where I sit in the emergency department. We have a 3-floor underground garage. Well, as of today, we have prepared approximately 200 emergency beds, which can be used, which will be divided up into a infected area and a non-infected area, so that we can deal with a pandemic crisis more along the lines of what you saw in New York or in Milan or something like that. And so that's been developed in our hospital and several other hospitals. A pandemic kind of infrastructure has come about. There's been other changes, the collaboration with the tech fields. people really wanted to do something and help do something about this. So here at the Rabin Medical Center, for instance, one of my residents has been engaged with the Ministry of Health and with some of the high-tech companies to try to develop a remote sensing system based on radar, where we'll be able to monitor patients without having any contact with them or any machines attached to them. So certainly things have worked their way into, as a result of this, of dealing with this pandemic, that may not have happened otherwise.
The other day, you told me about a lower tech invention. Is it the medical or the medical hijab that you?
I did mention that. Yes, there was at the beginning of this. There was a lot of uncertainty as to what is the proper level of personal protection equipment, because first, these teams have to be safe. You can't take care of somebody if you're sick yourself, and they have to be made. I think it was Scott who was talking about being safe and feeling safe in the building. Well, our teams need to be safe, but also feel safe in order to properly take care of people. And one of the things in the personal protective equipment was the question of whether masks and gowns were enough, or did we have to have something over our head as well? And we had developed, or really made use of something that existed, which covers the entire head and neck area, and we call it the medical hijab, which is based on the head covering of that traditional Muslim women wear, which does cover the head and the neck, and we have the other things for the face. But yes, that's quite low tech, quite cheap, and it gives more of a feeling of safety, especially when doing certain procedures. It's not necessary in taking care of people in general. I don't want people to think that they're not protected if somebody sees this who's taking care of patients in general, but in terms of doing more invasive procedures, it's something that we've adopted.
We've been talking about how in the States, the various crises we've experienced this year have really shone a light on inequalities in American life. Rabin Medical Center has a pretty big minority clientele. That is, I've read that a third of the patients you see are Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Israelis by whatever name. Do you see in Israel any great disparities between communities, either in the incidence of the virus or the severity of it?
The answer is yes. There have been pockets within certain communities. It's not strictly divided between Arab and Jew, but there was what we would call a hotspot in one of the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, and lately we've been seeing several in some of the Arab villages. Some of the Bedouin communities have been there's been a more concentrated high infection rate. But as of today, Tel Aviv is also having a high infection rate. So it's not necessarily divided up by any ethnic group, but certainly there has been some disparity, mostly I would say due to two things. One is where communication is less free, that is not free in the sense of freedom of speech, but in the sense of people being connected. So if you're dealing with the ultra-Orthodox community where the internet is not as widespread, or television, radio, they may be more cut off. They need other avenues of communication. In some Arab villages where perhaps Hebrew is not as freely spoken, they may have also special needs in terms of communication. So that is perhaps one of the inequalities. But generally speaking, I'll just mention, since you talk about Rabin Medical Center and our the minority population, we also have a lot of minority staff, and it is really one of the, I think, if you look in terms of coexistence in Israel, the health system in general, and Rabin in specific, to see that the collaboration and the day-to-day work with really out regard for your ethnic background, it's really quite remarkable and actually very satisfying and worth noting.
Is there a dramatic difference to you practicing medicine in Israel and practicing medicine in Connecticut in terms of insurance, in terms of access to healthcare?
Well, I was going to say the medicine is the medicine, and Israel's a very, the U.S. is well pointed in terms of technology, in terms of access, and Israel is also, we're not dealing with any difference in level of care. There is I think you'd say that in the U.S., by and large, my experience is that there is a greater discrepancy in terms of or a greater disparate nature in terms of poor, rich and poor. But working in the emergency department in both countries, we'll probably see the least amount of disparity because everybody gets care. We don't really ask about insurance and that kind of thing. But however, we're not immune to it. We know that we send somebody off to a private clinic, to a private doctor or a private clinic, that there's going to probably be a difference in the way they're going to be taken care of.
Well, Mike, thanks a lot for those observations. Hang around for the balance of our hour, and I hope to see you in Petah Tikva someday.
You'll be most welcome.
Thank you. It's time now for your questions, for questions from the attendees. If you use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, you can enter a question for any of our panelists, or for if you don't care which panelist answers it, we can put the question to them just as well. Mike, while we're waiting for a question to pop up, I should ask you. You mentioned the communities where we've had the hotspots. Are we talking largely about crowded living situations, or is there an issue of authority that the government health ministry isn't taken as seriously as the leader of the clan or the rebbe of the sect?
Right. Well, when we were talking about we had a kind of a mini second wave. Well, we were worried about a mini second wave in the city of Bnei Brak, which is not far from where we are here in Petah Tikva. It's a very densely populated ultra-Orthodox community. And there was a time when there was a high rate of infection, and the question was why? Why didn't they get the memo? And I think that really it was that they didn't get the memo. They didn't get the memo because the memo was sent through the internet and it was sent through television. And clearly there are community influencers, and in this case it is the rabbis and the community leaders. And once they were brought on board and things were made clearer, that really became a much more controllable situation. And now, as far as I know, there is no specific increase there. There are in some of the Jerusalem neighborhoods, but not strictly limited to the ultra-Orthodox.
Well, we have some questions from attendees, and the first one is directed to E.J. Dionne. E.J., in the last election, people believed that Hillary Clinton would win against Donald Trump in a landslide. Why do you think now there's a difference?
Well, I think we misremember if we think a landslide, because we tend to think of those probabilities that were wrong, 80% chance of Hillary winning. That sounds like a landslide. It was not predictive of a landslide. The polls showed her ahead in the popular vote, which is where she ended up. They were only about a point or two ahead. Why, if I can put the question this way, why is this election different from the last election? And I think there are a couple of things we are seeing that are different. One, Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton. There was enormous hostility in the electorate to Hillary Clinton. I didn't personally share it, I should say, but it was out there on election day. 60% of Americans, according to the exit poll, had a negative view of Donald Trump, but 55% had a negative view of Hillary Clinton. If you looked at voters who had a negative view of both of them, they voted for Donald Trump roughly 40-30, so that the people who disliked both of them were voting for Trump. This time, when you look at voters who dislike both of them, they are voting overwhelmingly for Joe Biden because Biden does not present as big a target as Hillary Clinton did. He doesn't inspire the same hostility that she did, and Trump is the incumbent. He is not the unknown. The other thing that struck me during the primaries while they were going before the pandemic is that in counties where Bernie Sanders beat Hillary Clinton back in 2016 in rural and small town areas, and many of those counties then voted for Donald Trump, in Michigan, for example, this time Joe Biden was beating Bernie Sanders in those counties. So it appears that there is a movement away from Trump. Last piece of data, the midterm elections, where in all three of the big swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Democrats won both the governorship and the Senate seat by picking up 10 or 15% of the Trump voters, plus inspiring new turnout. So I don't think, can predictors go wrong? I always say I quit the prognosticators union on midnight of election night, but you can't chase the bookie from the track. So I'm still there offering a forecast.
Right.
But I do think this feels very different and the numbers look very different than 2016.
Thank you, EJ. Question for Scott Rechler. Scott, how do you deal with the staggered openings for non-hourly workers, for example, people who have scheduled conference calls and the like?
Yeah, so there's an app in our app that can actually put in their proposed times to start. And if someone has a specific need, then the company themselves can adjust other people to make sure that that it works. And, really for this to work, the whole ecosystem of the building needs to work. And most of our buildings have multiple companies that operate in the building. So we've actually had our tenants sign a community compact agreeing that they will all coordinate. And so when everyone puts in their requested times into our app, it then feeds them back, where there might be conflict of heavy congestion areas, and asks them with suggestions for them to then put modifications in.
Okay, question for Yuval Rooz. Do you anticipate an influx of new types of Zoom? Will companies begin creating their own Zoom type programs? Do you see this already happening?
I don't think so. I think that we have plenty of variety already there. I think that all we're going to see is probably new features and really focusing on some of the accessibility features of making these applications stream better and just work better for everyone.
A question for Dr. Mike Drescher. How do you understand the difference between a continuing first wave of coronavirus and a new second wave of the coronavirus?
Well, to some degree, it's a semantic difference. The coronavirus never went away. It's not a wave in the sense that the flu season, comes in October, goes away in April every year, and then it comes again, another wave. The coronavirus didn't come again. It's not that it had gone away. It was always there. It was latently there. And as soon as you let people begin to have more contact with each other, you're going to have more spread of the illness. There's just no way around it. From the extreme of letting everybody do as they want, making no adjustments to behavior, to the extreme of letting nobody be in touch with anybody. And you can either have uncontrolled spread or no spread at all. And the key is to find where where you get the most the most safety in terms of the virus at the least cost, and that is a societal question as well as a epidemiological one.
There's another question for you, Mike. Dr. Drescher, how useful are these, quote, new cases numbers that we hear of every day when they don't break the figures down into categories such as asymptomatic, mild, and recommended stay at home for a number of days, or requiring hospitalization?
Well, that's a sophisticated question, and it is key to understand that. Look, if yesterday you did 10 tests and had 9 people positive, and today you did 100 tests and had 50 people positive, that's a very different. The fact that you had 50 people positive versus 9 the day before doesn't take into account the fact you did 10 times more testing. So the first thing is how many tests are you doing? The second thing is, as you said, as the questioner pointed out, a lot of people are asymptomatic. Now, asymptomatic does not mean that you're unable to spread the disease. It probably means that you're much less likely, but it's also something to be taken into account. What is more important, really the harder statistics, the better ones to look at, are numbers of patients who are admitted to the hospital, because those, pretty much everybody who's sick enough to get admitted, that's something that can be compared day to day or week to week. And death rates, of course, also have a fairly strong, you can count them all at any given time. But the question is appropriate, and those things need to be asked when you're looking at the data.
Here's a question for Scott Rechler. How do you anticipate the real estate costs impacting the economy? For example, the decrease in rental leasing of office space, fewer residential rentals in cities.
Again, I think in the short term, obviously, in like any downturn, there'll be a slowdown of some of that, and you'll see in that slowdown pricing will come down. And you know, frankly, you know, one of the things that we've seen in this pandemic is trends that were happening anyway are being accelerated. And so we have had a challenge in our major cities of the cost of real estate. So the fact that pricing comes down a little bit, frankly, the fact there might be a distributed workforce, that people are working around the edge of the city and have satellite offices or remote working is actually, from a policy standpoint, not a bad thing because it will reduce congestion, take some of the strain off of our public transit, and then also enable us to make the city more affordable for more people.
Another question for you. As COVID-19 has crippled culture in New York City, from independent restaurants to theater companies to nightlife in New York, how can real estate play a role in assuring New York City's culture bounces back and that the city continues to be a great place to live and thrive as a cultural hub?
Yeah, that's a great question. And probably one of my biggest concerns is the small businesses and our cultural institutions that don't have the staying power to live through this type of environment where the very heart of their existence is to bring people together, whether that's Lincoln Center or some of the local restaurants. And so wherever we can be helpful on the restaurant small business side, we are, in terms of being a partner with them, realizing that the value they bring to our community, our downtowns, are beyond the economic value of the rent they pay. And so working with them and trying to do that. And then on the cultural institutions, I think this is one of the ones where we need the people that have the capacity within the city to step up and help these institutions bridge themselves to wherever we get to on the other side of the new abnormal, whether again that's a vaccine or that is some mix of therapeutics and testing that make these environments ones that people can go to along the way. Because to your point, that is the very, at the heart of the vitality of our city.
Yeah, I should mention you're involved. You're is it vice chair or co-chair of the Tribeca Film Festival?
Right, co-chair of Tribeca.
Our film festival is going to be login events.
I mean, they have been. There's some that are doing that now. It's hard, right? Those, and the same thing. I'm also vice chair of the 9/11 Memorial Museum, which is even, more challenging because a lot of the people that come there, right, you're going inside to the museum, you're in close quarters, and a lot of people from around the country and the world come to that location. So, just like we did with our office buildings, we're trying to reimagine. How do we exist through the new abnormal and do the best we can do and be prepared for when things become normal on the other side?
And one more question for E.J. Dionne, rather broad one. Would you but I can't give you too much time to answer it. How would you comment on the crisis in the Justice Department, E.J.? Is there a crisis in the Justice Department?
I do think there's a crisis in the Justice Department. I think when you go back to William Barr's testimony before the Senate, when he was ultimately confirmed, he made very clear then that he had an extraordinarily expansive view of presidential power and that he was willing to interpret an awful lot of law in the president's favor. And I think it was what is really remarkable about what happened to the U.S. Attorney in New York is that Mr. Barr's initial statement was flatly untrue. He had not agreed to resign. That fact alone raises enormous questions about what Barr was up to. And I think it's going to be very important to find out why did that happen. And you've had other resignations in the Justice Department. I think we're going to be hearing a lot about this in the coming month. And I think Jerry Nadler at the Judiciary Committee is going to have hearings very soon on all of this. But I think it is very troubling. But I think Barr's initial comments when he was confirmed were troubling. And so what's happened since should not be a shock to us as it is to some.
Well, E.J. Dionne, thanks to you and to all of our panelists, Dr. Mike Drescher, Yuval Rooz, and Scott Rechler, and a double thank you to Yuval, actually, because his team at Digital Asset helped us get online today. So thanks to all of you. The American Friends of Rabin Medical Center is a 501c3 nonprofit representing in the US, Israel's biggest hospital, Rabin Medical Center. The website for the center is www.afrmc.org. Thanks to Nate Bonzani and Ronnie Giuliano and of course, Joshua Plout of AFRMC for making all of this happen. And I hope that you will save the date for our next Global Connections Virtual Leaders Forum. It is on July 22nd at 4 o'clock, from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Our guest will be David Brooks, op-ed columnist for the New York Times. You can register at globalconnections.splashthat.com. Please invite your colleagues and friends to join us next month at Global Connections, Navigating the New Abnormal. I'm Robert Siegel. Stay healthy and see you in July.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, everyone.